Tonight, we're going to travel the length of an entire civilization. Not a single life or a single battle, but the whole vast sweep of the oldest and longest-lived kingdom the world has ever known. We're going to watch ancient Egypt rise out of the mud of a river, climb to a glory that has never been equaled, and fall at last, after 30 centuries, into the arms of Rome. It is the longest story there is, and we have all night to drift through it. Think of the span of it. When the last pharaoh died, the first pyramids were already so ancient that more time separated her from their builders than separates us from her. Egypt did not last for centuries. It lasted for millennia, rising and falling and rising again, dynasty after dynasty, for longer than the entire history of most nations that have ever existed. Kingdoms we think of as impossibly old were, to the Egyptians, recent. Rome itself was young, when Egypt was already unimaginably old. So settle in, and let the years begin to flow, because that is the right word for how this story moves. It flows, like the river that made it. To understand everything that follows, every pharaoh, every pyramid, every golden age and every collapse, you have to begin where Egypt itself began, with the water. So let us go all the way back, before the first king, before the first stone was cut, to a green ribbon of life winding through an endless desert, and the river that gave birth to a world. Picture the land as it truly is, from above, here in the quiet. All around, in every direction, stretches desert, a vast, dead, waterless waste of sand and rock, one of the harshest places on earth, where almost nothing can live. And through the middle of that lifeless expanse runs a single, impossible line of green. A narrow band of lush, fertile, living land, following the course of a great river as it flows north across the desert to the sea. That river is the Nile, the longest in the world, and that thin green ribbon along its banks is Egypt. Everything that Egypt ever was grew in that narrow strip of green, hemmed in on both sides by the endless desert. The Egyptians understood exactly how much they owed the river. Without it, their whole world would simply be more desert. With it, they had one of the richest farmlands on earth, and the reason was a yearly miracle that the Egyptians built their entire civilization around. Once every year, with the regularity of the seasons, the Nile would flood. Swollen by distant rains far to the south, the river would rise and overflow its banks, spreading out across the low land on either side, drowning the fields under water, and then slowly recede. And when the water pulled back, it left behind, spread across the fields, a fresh layer of rich, black, fertile silt carried down from far upriver. New soil, laid down free every single year, so fruitful that the Egyptians could grow food in abundance with almost laughable ease. They called their country the Black Land, after that dark, life-giving mud, and the desert beyond it the Red Land, the realm of death. The flood was so central to their lives that they measured their whole calendar by it, and saw in its yearly death and rebirth the very rhythm of the universe. This is the foundation of everything, a river that flooded like clockwork, laying down free wealth every year, in the middle of a desert that protected the land on every side from invasion. Abundant food and natural walls of sand. It was the perfect cradle for a civilization, and out of it, slowly, over long ages, the people of the river began to build one. At first, there was no single Egypt. Along the green ribbon, over many centuries, farming villages grew into towns, and towns into small kingdoms, and gradually these gathered into two. An upper kingdom in the south, along the narrow valley of the river, and a lower kingdom in the north, where the Nile spread out into a wide, marshy fan of channels near the sea, the delta. Two lands, two crowns, two peoples, sharing one river, sometimes trading, sometimes at war. And then, in a moment that Egyptian tradition remembered as the true beginning of their history, the two lands became one. A king of the south, remembered by a name that has come down to us as Nama, or means conquered the north and united the whole of the river valley under a single crown. He is celebrated as the first pharaoh of a unified Egypt, the founder of the first dynasty of kings, and his unification of the two lands became the foundational act of Egyptian civilization, celebrated for the next 3,000 years. From that point on, the pharaoh would wear a double crown, combining the crown of the south with the crown of the north, a permanent symbol that he ruled the two lands as one. Every pharaoh who ever reigned, down to Cleopatra herself, was in some sense an heir of that first unification. With unification came the things that make a civilization. Writing was born, the beautiful picture script we call hieroglyphs, used to record the deeds of kings and the words of the gods. A system of government took shape, with the pharaoh at its head, believed to be not merely a king, but a living god, the earthly embodiment of divine order, the one man who stood between the people and the gods and kept the whole cosmos in balance. A religion of astonishing richness developed, with its great family of gods and its deep obsession with the afterlife, and a state capable of organizing the labor of thousands began to form along the river. Egypt had become a kingdom, and it was about to enter the age that would produce its most famous and eternal achievement. An age when the pharaohs would reach for immortality by building mountains of stone. The gods and the afterlife filled the Egyptian imagination, but most Egyptians, of course, were not gods or god-kings. They were ordinary people, living ordinary lives along the river, generation after generation, and their world too is worth drifting through, because it went on, largely unchanged, beneath all the rise and fall of dynasties, for thousands of years. While pharaohs came and went, and empires rose and collapsed, the deep rhythm of ordinary Egyptian life stayed remarkably the same, tied to the eternal cycle of the river. The whole of that life was ruled by the flood, and by the three great seasons the Egyptians divided their year into, each named for what the river was doing. First came the season of the flooding, when the Nile rose and spread across the land and drowned the fields. During those weeks the farmland lay underwater, and there was no farming to be done. And so this was the season when the pharaohs could call upon the idle farmers to labor on their great monuments, feeding and housing the workers who built the pyramids and temples during the months the fields were drowned. Then came the season of the growing, when the waters receded and left the fresh black mud behind, and the farmers went out to plow the soft, rich earth and sow their seed. And last came the season of the harvest, when the grain stood golden and ripe, and the whole village turned out to reap it before the river rose again, and the cycle began anew. Flood, growth, harvest, flood again. Around and around, year after year, the eternal wheel of the Egyptian year turning with the river. Most Egyptians were farmers, and their lives were simple, hard, and closely bound to the land and the water. They lived in modest houses of mud brick, the same Nile mud, shaped and dried in the sun, clustered in villages along the green strip, cool in the heat of the day, close and warm at night. They grew grain for bread and beer, the two staples of the Egyptian diet, and tended gardens of onions and leeks and beans and cucumbers, and kept cattle and goats and geese, and fished the endless river, and hunted birds in its marshes. They dressed simply, in light linen against the heat. They loved their families, and their children, and their cats, which they adored, and which held a sacred place in Egyptian life. They enjoyed music and dancing, and beer and festivals. They worked hard under a hot sun, and paid their taxes in grain and labor to the pharaoh and the temples, and lived, most of them, lives that were humble and unrecorded, but not, by the standards of the ancient world, unhappy. Egypt was a rich land, and its people were, on the whole, well fed. Above the farmers stood the skilled workers and craftsmen, the potters and weavers, the carpenters and metalworkers, the stonemasons and jewelers whose exquisite work fills our museums today. And above them, a class prized above almost all others, the scribes. In a world where almost no one could read or write, the ability to master the beautiful, complex picture script of the hieroglyphs was a rare and precious skill, a ticket out of hard manual labor and into the comfortable ranks of officials and administrators. A boy who trained for years as a scribe could rise to run estates, temples, even the government itself. The Egyptians wrote texts urging young men to study hard and become scribes, praising the scribes' clean and easy life over the misery of every other trade. The farmer at the mercy of the flood, the soldier marching to war, the craftsman toiling in the heat. To read and write was to hold the keys to the kingdom. And above them all rose the great pyramid of Egyptian society, tier upon tier, the officials, the priests, the nobles, the royal family, narrowing up and up to the single figure at the very apex, the living God who owned the whole land and everyone in it, who stood between the people and the gods, and upon whose proper rule the survival of the entire ordered world was believed to depend. The pharaoh. His monuments are what remain to us most vividly, and it is time now to return to them, to the age when the god-kings raised mountains of stone and reached, with the whole strength of the kingdom, for the stars. Before we follow the kings, we have to understand the world as the Egyptians themselves understood it, because to them, the story of Egypt did not begin with the first pharaoh. It began before the world existed at all, in the mind of the gods, and their vision of how everything came to be is one of the most beautiful creation stories ever told, and a fitting place to drift as the night deepens. In the beginning, the Egyptians said, there was no earth and no sky, no sun and no living thing. There was only water, a vast, dark, silent, endless ocean of nothingness, without shape or limit, stretching in every direction forever. They called this dark water the Nun, the primeval sea, the formless deep that existed before anything else. There was no light in it, no land, no time, only the still, black, boundless water waiting. And then out of that dark water, something rose. In the most ancient of their tellings, a single mound of earth emerged from the endless sea, the first dry land, the first solid thing, lifting up out of the water exactly the way the fertile mounds of Egypt rose each year out of the receding flood. And upon that first mound, or rising with it, came the first god, the creator, who brought himself into being out of the dark water by his own will, the first living thing in all the universe. Different cities of Egypt told this first god's story in different ways and by different names, but most often he was the sun, the great sun god, blazing into existence and lifting into the empty sky, the first light in all that endless dark. Picture that first dawn, the dark, still, infinite water, the single mound of earth rising from it, and then the very first sunrise, the first light that had ever shone, breaking over a world that had never known light, the sun god lifting into the sky, and the long day of the world beginning. The Egyptians never forgot that image. Every single sunrise, for 3,000 years, they saw as a reenactment of that first morning of creation, the sun reborn out of darkness, the triumph of light and life over the formless dark. It was the deepest rhythm of their faith. From that first creator God came the others, generation by generation, until the world was full of divine powers. The Egyptians had a vast and beautiful family of gods, hundreds of them, governing every force of nature and every part of life. But a handful stood at the center of their imagination, and their story is the great myth at the heart of Egyptian religion. There was the sky, stretched over the world, imagined as a great goddess arching her body across the heavens, her fingertips and toes touching the four horizons, her belly spangled with all the stars, bending protectively over the earth. And there was the earth below her, a god lying beneath the sky. Between them was the air that held them apart. The Egyptians looked up at the night and saw not empty space but the body of a goddess, curved over them in the dark, and the stars were the lights upon her. And then there were the four who mattered most to the human heart, 2 brothers and 2 sisters, born of the earth and sky, whose tangled story of love and murder and resurrection the Egyptians told and retold for thousands of years, and built much of their hope for eternity upon. The first was Osiris, and he was good. He became the first divine king of Egypt, ruling the land in a golden age, and he was beloved, a wise and gentle king who, the Egyptians said, taught humankind the arts of civilization. How to farm, how to grow grain and vines, how to live in peace under just laws, how to worship the gods. Beside him ruled his sister and wife, the goddess Isis, devoted, brilliant, and mighty in magic, the most beloved goddess of all Egypt, the Great Mother, the faithful wife whose love would prove stronger than death itself. But Osiris had a brother, and the brother's name was Set, a god of the desert, of storms and chaos and violence, and he burned with envy of his good brother's throne. And so Set did the first murder. He plotted against Osiris, trapped him by a trick, killed him, and in the fuller versions of the tale, cut his body apart and scattered the pieces the length and breadth of Egypt, so that his brother could never be whole again, and seized the throne for himself. The good king was dead, murdered by his own brother, his body torn apart and scattered across the land. Chaos had killed order. The desert had murdered the green. And here the story becomes one of the most moving in all of mythology. Isis, the grieving widow, would not accept her husband's death. She set out, alone in mourning, to wander the whole of Egypt in search of the scattered pieces of her murdered love, traveling the length of the land, gathering the fragments of his body one by one, wherever Set had flung them. And when she had gathered them, she used her great magic, with the help of other gods, to bind her husband's body back together, to make him whole again, and to breathe life back into him. The first mummy, the first resurrection, the dead made whole and living again through love and magic and the proper rites. Osiris returned to life, but he did not return to rule the living. Instead, he passed into the next world and became its king, the lord of the dead, the god of the afterlife, the divine ruler of the realm beyond death, where every Egyptian hoped one day to join him. His death and resurrection became the promise at the heart of Egyptian faith. That death was not the end, that the dead, like Osiris, could be made whole and live again forever. And there was one more turn to the tale. Before he passed into the next world, the resurrected Osiris and the faithful Isis conceived a son, Horus, the falcon god, the hawk whose eyes were the sun and the moon. Isis hid the child in the marshes and raised him in secret, protecting him from his murderous uncle Set, until Horus grew to manhood and set out to avenge his father and reclaim his stolen throne. The struggle between Horus and Set, between the rightful heir and the usurper, between order and chaos, between the green land and the cruel desert, raged across the myths, a long and terrible contest of battles and trials. But in the end, Horus prevailed. He defeated Set, avenged his murdered father, and took his rightful place as king of the living world, while his father Osiris reigned over the dead. Order was restored. The rightful king sat on the throne, and from that time on, every living pharaoh of Egypt was seen as the living embodiment of Horus, the rightful divine king, and every dead pharaoh became an Osiris, passing into the next world to reign among the blessed dead. The great myth was not just a story, it was the pattern of kingship itself, reenacted with every pharaoh who lived and died, for an almost unimaginable span of years. The living king was Horus, the dead king was Osiris, and the whole of Egyptian civilization was built upon the victory of order over chaos, of life over death, that this ancient family of gods had won at the dawn of the world. The Egyptians worshipped a vast family of gods, hundreds of them, governing every force of nature, every place, every part of life. And to drift among them a while is to wander through one of the richest imaginations any people has ever possessed. Let us meet a few of the greatest, the ones whose names and forms recur again and again across 3 millennia of Egyptian faith. Greatest of all in most ages was the sun god, the creator, the lord of the sky, whom we have already followed on his nightly journey through the underworld. He was often shown as a man with the head of a hawk, crowned with the disk of the sun, or simply as the blazing disk itself. He was the source of all life and light, the first god, the king of the gods, and the pharaoh himself was called the son of the sun. In the great imperial age, he became merged with the hidden god of the capital into a single supreme deity, king of all the gods, whose vast temple dominated Egypt. Then there were the four we have already met, whose great myth lay at the heart of Egyptian hope. The good King Osiris, murdered and resurrected, who became lord of the dead and judge of the afterlife, usually shown as a mummified king, his skin green or black, the colors of resurrection and the fertile earth. His faithful wife Isis, the great mother, mighty in magic, who gathered his scattered body and brought him back to life. The most beloved goddess in all of Egypt, protector of the living and the dead, whose worship would one day spread far beyond Egypt across the whole Roman world. Their son Horus, the falcon god, the avenger, the rightful king, embodied in every living pharaoh. And their enemy Set, the god of the desert, of storms, chaos, and violence, not purely evil, for the Egyptians saw him as a necessary force too, the wild power that also, in some tales, defended the sun god's boat against the serpent of chaos, but forever the murderer, the usurper, the embodiment of disorder. There was Anubis, the god of embalming and the dead, shown as a man with the black head of a jackal, for jackals prowled the desert edges where the dead were buried, and so the Egyptians made the jackal into the very guardian of the tombs and the guide of the dead. It was Anubis who was believed to have performed the first embalming on the body of Osiris, and Anubis who watched over every mummy and led the souls of the dead to the hall of judgment and worked the great scales on which their hearts were weighed. There was Thoth, the god of wisdom, writing, knowledge, and the moon, shown as a man with the head of an ibis, or as a baboon. He was the divine scribe, the inventor of writing, the keeper of all knowledge, the god who recorded the verdict at the weighing of the heart and mediated the disputes of the gods. To him the Egyptians credited their sacred writings, their science, their magic, all the learning that made their civilization great. And there were the gentle and joyful ones. There was Hathor, goddess of love, beauty, music, dancing, and joy, often shown as a cow or as a woman with a cow's horns cradling the sun disk, a warm and beloved goddess of pleasure and motherhood and celebration. There was Bastet, the cat goddess, protector of the home and of women and children, guardian against evil and disease, gentle and loving. For the Egyptians adored cats above all animals, kept them as cherished pets, and mourned them deeply when they died. There was the dwarf god of the household, a cheerful, protective spirit who guarded families, mothers, and children, and drove away evil and bad dreams from the home at night. A homely, friendly god whose image the Egyptians kept close in their houses, especially over the beds where they slept. For the Egyptian world was full of gods, great and small cosmic deities who ruled the sun and the sky and the judgment of the dead, and humble household spirits who guarded the sleeping family against the terrors of the night. Every force of nature, every stage of life, every danger and every joy had its divine guardian. It was a world thick with the sacred, where the divine was never far away, where a person moved through their day and their life surrounded and watched over by a great invisible company of gods. And it was a world that believed, above all, that order would triumph over chaos, that light would return after darkness, and that death itself could be conquered, and life renewed forever. It is a gentle thought to rest upon. To imagine yourself, as an Egyptian would have, watched over in the darkness by the kindly household god who guards the sleeping, while far below the world the sun sails safely through the night toward another dawn. Of all the beliefs the Egyptians held, one is perhaps the most beautiful and the most fitting to drift upon as the night grows deep. Their vision of what the sun did each night after it set. For the Egyptians did not see the sunset as a simple ending. They saw it as the beginning of the sun god's most perilous and important journey, a nightly voyage through darkness and death and back to rebirth, reenacted every single night the world has ever known. By day, they believed, the sun god sailed across the sky in his golden boat, from the eastern horizon, where he was born each dawn, to the western horizon, where he descended each dusk. But when the sun sank below the edge of the world in the west, it did not simply vanish. It entered the underworld, the dark realm beneath the earth, the land of the dead, the domain of Osiris, and began a long, dangerous night voyage through 12 dark hours, sailing his boat through the caverns and rivers of the world below, from the west back around to the east, to be reborn again at dawn. And that voyage through the dark was full of peril. As the sun god sailed his boat through the 12 hours of the night, he had to pass through gate after gate, each guarded, each requiring the proper words and the proper knowledge to pass. He sailed through regions of profound darkness, bringing his light briefly to the dead who dwelt there, who woke and rejoiced for the hour that the sun passed among them, and then fell back into darkness and sleep as he moved on. And in the deepest, most dangerous hour of the night, the sun god faced his great enemy, a monstrous serpent of chaos, an enormous snake that lay in wait in the darkness of the underworld to swallow the sun and stop it forever, to end the cycle of rebirth and plunge the world into eternal night. Every single night, in the deep dark, the forces of order aboard the sun god's boat had to do battle with this serpent of chaos, fighting to hold it off, to wound and repel it, so that the sun could sail on toward the dawn. And every night, order won. The serpent was driven back, the dark passage completed, and the sun god, having journeyed through the whole of the underworld, through death itself, emerged at last from the eastern horizon, reborn, renewed, rising into the morning sky to begin the day anew. The dawn, to the Egyptians, was a daily miracle and a daily victory. The triumph of light over darkness, order over chaos, life over death, won again in the depths of every night while the world slept. There is something wonderful in this, to carry down toward your own sleep. The Egyptians looked at the darkness of the night not as empty or dead, but as a great sacred journey unfolding beneath the world. The sun traveling through the realm of the dead, doing battle with chaos in the deep hours, and winning through, always, to rise again in the morning. The dark was not to be feared. It was the passage through which light was renewed, and every dawn that has ever broken, and every dawn that will break over you tomorrow, was, to the Egyptians, the safe return of the sun from its long night voyage through the dark. The promise, made new every single morning, that after the deepest darkness, the light always comes back. Because they believed what they believed about Osiris, that death could be conquered, that the dead could live again, the Egyptians became, more than any people who have ever lived, a civilization obsessed with eternity. Death, to them, was not an ending but a doorway, and the whole aim of life was to pass through that doorway safely and live forever in the next world. Almost everything they built that still astonishes us, the pyramids, the tombs, the mummies, the treasures buried in the earth, was built for that single purpose, to defeat death and to live forever. But eternity had to be earned and prepared for with enormous care. The Egyptians believed a person was made of several parts, the body and the name and the shadow, and above all, the invisible spark of life force and the soul that could travel between the worlds. And for a person to live on after death, these parts had to be preserved and reunited. The soul might travel out into the next world by day, but it needed to return each night to a body it could recognize, a home to rest in. And so the body could not be allowed to rot away, or the soul would be left homeless. And the second, final death, the true annihilation the Egyptians feared above all things, would follow. The body had to be preserved, and out of that need came one of the most remarkable arts the ancient world ever developed. We have seen this art before, on the night we spent with the boy king in his tomb, but it belongs here too, at the heart of the Egyptian world. So let us pass through it gently once more. Over the course of about 70 days, with enormous skill and reverence, the embalmers prepared the body to last forever. It was cleansed and treated, and carefully dried with special salts drawn from the desert, which drew out all the moisture that would otherwise bring decay. It was anointed with precious oils and fragrant resins, and then it was wrapped, slowly, lovingly, in layer upon layer of fine linen, hundreds of yards of it, wound around and around the body in careful, practiced folds. And as they wrapped, the priests laid sacred amulets and charms between the layers of linen, small protective objects of gold and precious stone, each one placed at its proper spot, each carrying its own spell to guard the body and speed the soul on its dangerous journey. A charm at the throat, a sacred eye over the heart, protective signs at every turn of the wrapping. Prayers were spoken over every stage. The whole slow process was a sacred ritual, a reenactment of what the gods had done for Osiris himself, gathering and binding and preserving the body so that it might live again. And when it was finished, the wrapped and blessed body, the mummy, was placed within a coffin, often shaped in the person's own likeness, and laid to rest in the tomb, surrounded by everything the soul would need in the world to come. For those who could afford it, the tomb was filled with the things of life: furniture, food and drink, clothing and jewelry, games and tools, and little carved figures of servants who would do the dead person's work for them in the next world, so they might live in ease and comfort forever. The walls were painted with scenes of the good life, and with the sacred spells that would protect and guide the soul. Everything was made ready, and then the tomb was sealed, and the dead began their journey through the dark toward the hall of judgment and eternity. For the journey was not without peril, and eternity was not guaranteed. The soul of the dead had to travel through the perilous underworld, a dark and dangerous realm of gates and guardians, of monsters and trials, through which the soul had to find its way by knowing the proper words and spells. This is why they buried with the dead the collections of sacred texts we call the Book of the Dead, not a single book, but a body of spells and prayers and maps of the underworld, meant to guide the soul safely past every danger, to give it the words to speak to each guardian, the knowledge to survive the dark passage and reach the hall where its fate would be decided. And at the end of that passage lay the most solemn moment in all of Egyptian belief, the weighing of the heart. The soul was brought at last into a great hall, the hall of judgment, before Osiris himself, the Lord of the dead, enthroned in majesty, and before a tribunal of gods. And there the dead person's heart, which the Egyptians believed to be the seat of the mind and the character, the record of everything a person had done in life, was placed upon a great golden scale, and on the other pan of the scale was set a single feather, the feather of truth, the symbol of the goddess of divine order and justice, the rightness that held the whole universe together. And the heart was weighed against the feather. If the person had lived a good and just life, their heart would be light, light as the feather of truth, and the scales would balance, and the soul would be judged worthy, and welcomed into the eternal paradise of Osiris, to live forever in a perfect land, a green and fruitful mirror of Egypt itself, where the flood was always kind and the harvest never failed. But if the person had lived a life heavy with cruelty and lies and wrongdoing, their heart would be heavy with it, heavier than the feather, and the scales would tip. And then a terrible fate waited. Crouching beside the scales was a monster, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, the devourer of the dead. And a heart that failed the weighing was cast to her and eaten, and the soul was destroyed utterly, annihilated, denied all hope of eternity. That was the second death, the final death, the only thing the Egyptians truly feared. Not to die, but to be judged unworthy and to cease to exist forever. There is something profound in that ancient scene, and something worth carrying gently down towards sleep. These people, thousands of years ago, believed that at the end of every life there would be a reckoning, that what mattered in the final weighing was not how rich or powerful or famous a person had been, not how great their monuments, but simply whether they had lived with a light heart, honestly, justly, and kindly. The mightiest pharaoh and the humblest farmer faced the same scale and the same feather. It was one of the oldest expressions of a hope that runs through all of human history, that in the end, goodness matters and is remembered and is rewarded. The Egyptians built their whole civilization around that hope and around the dream of a life beyond this one. A dream so powerful that it filled their deserts with tombs and their tombs with gold, and drove them to build the greatest monuments the world had ever seen. And it is to those monuments and to the god-kings who built them that our story now returns. To the ancient Egyptian, the world was not the cold, mechanical place we sometimes imagine our own to be. It was alive with unseen power, thick with spirits and gods and forces, a world in which magic was as real and as practical as farming or building. A genuine force that ran through everything, that could be understood and channeled and used by the gods, by the priests, and in humbler ways, by ordinary people. To drift through the Egyptian world of magic is to enter one of the most enchanted imaginations any people has ever had. Magic, to the Egyptians, was a real power in the universe, one of the forces the Creator had woven into the world at the beginning, a power that even the gods used and depended upon. It was through magic that Isis had gathered and restored the body of Osiris and brought him back to life. It was through magic that the sun god was protected each night on his dangerous voyage through the underworld. And it was through magic, through the right words, the right images, the right rituals, spoken and made in the right way, that human beings could reach into this unseen world and shape it. To heal the sick, to protect against danger, to guard the dead, to ensure the flood and the harvest, to defend against the countless evils, seen and unseen, that lurked in the world. For ordinary Egyptians, this magic was woven through every part of daily life, a source of comfort and protection in a world full of dangers they could not otherwise control. They wore amulets, small charms of stone or faience, shaped like sacred symbols or protective gods, to guard themselves against harm, against disease, against the evil eye, against the dangers of childbirth, against snakes and scorpions and all the perils of their world. They carried charms to bring good fortune, to ensure fertility, to protect their children. They kept images of the friendly household gods in their homes, especially the cheerful dwarf god who guarded families and drove away the terrors that came in the night, watching over the beds where they slept and protecting them from bad dreams and evil spirits in the dark. They used spells and rituals for every crisis and hope of life. A mother feared for her child would speak protective incantations over it. A person bitten by a snake or stung by a scorpion, a real and deadly danger in Egypt, would be treated with a combination of practical remedies and powerful magical spells, invoking the gods who had triumphed over such dangers. Words themselves held power. To speak a name, to write it, to say the right formula, was to reach into the fabric of reality and change it. This is why the Egyptians were so careful about names, and so afraid of having their names erased. For to destroy a person's name was, in a sense, to destroy them, to unmake their existence. and it is why they filled their tombs with spells and their bodies with amulets. The whole apparatus of the afterlife was, in a sense, a great work of protective magic, arming the dead with the words and charms they would need to survive the perilous journey to eternity. There is something beautiful and even comforting in this vision of the world, a world in which nothing was merely dead matter, in which every danger had its protective charm and every fear its guardian spirit, in which the humblest farmer, armed with the right amulet and the right words, could reach out and touch the unseen powers that governed all things. The Egyptians moved through their lives surrounded by the sacred and the magical, watched over by their gods, protected by their charms, comforted by the knowledge that the same magic that had raised Osiris from death and guided the sun safely through the night was there for them too in their small human struggles, guarding their children and their sleep. It is a gentle thing to rest upon at the end of the day, to imagine a world so full of protective magic, so watched over, so unafraid of the dark, held safe in the palm of the sacred, as the Egyptians believed themselves to be, and as, in their long and wonderful civilization, they lived and died for 3,000 years. The first great age of Egyptian power is the one we call the Old Kingdom, and it is the age of the pyramids. For this was when the pharaohs, now secure and rich and worshipped as gods, turned the wealth of the river and the labor of the whole kingdom toward a single overwhelming purpose, building tombs that would carry them into eternity and stand forever as proof of their glory. It did not begin with the great smooth-sided pyramids we picture. It began with a single act of genius. An early pharaoh named Djoser employed a brilliant advisor, a man named Imhotep, an architect, priest, and thinker so gifted that later Egyptians would remember him as a god. And Imhotep conceived something no one had built before. Instead of the low, flat-topped mud brick tombs that had housed earlier kings, he built, in stone, a tomb of 6 great steps, rising one upon another like a giant staircase reaching toward the sky. It was the first pyramid, the Step Pyramid, and it was the largest stone building anyone had ever raised. It still stands today. With it, the Egyptians discovered that they could build in stone on a colossal scale, and that a pharaoh's tomb could be a mountain. From that first step pyramid, the ambition grew swiftly. Later kings experimented, refined, and reached higher, until at last, at a place called Giza, near the northern end of the valley, the art reached its absolute and never-surpassed peak. There a pharaoh named Khufu built the largest pyramid ever raised, the Great Pyramid of Giza, the only survivor of the 7 wonders of the ancient world still standing today. We have walked this ground before, you and I, on another night, so I will not linger over every stone, but pause with me here, because this is the summit of the whole Old Kingdom, the moment when Egyptian civilization did the single most astonishing thing it would ever do. Consider what it took. More than 2 million blocks of stone, some weighing many tons, cut with copper tools and sand, floated down the river, hauled up ramps, and set in place by hand by an army of skilled workers and seasonal laborers, not slaves as the old myth would have it, but organized crews of Egyptians, fed on bread and beer, proud of their work. They raised it to a height that would remain the tallest structure made by human hands for nearly 4,000 years. They aligned it to the stars with an accuracy that still astonishes engineers, and they finished it in the reign of a single king, as a stairway to carry that king's soul up to join the undying stars. It was the greatest concentration of wealth, labor, skill, and ambition the world had ever seen, poured into one perfect mountain of stone by a civilization only a few centuries into its existence. Egypt, at the height of the Old Kingdom, could do things that would not be equaled for thousands of years. And beside the Great Pyramids, a later king set a guardian, the Great Sphinx, an enormous lion with the face of a pharaoh, carved from a single outcrop of rock, gazing east toward the rising sun, keeping its watch over the tombs of the god-kings. It has kept that watch ever since, through every age that followed, half buried and dug out again and again across the millennia, the silent face of the old kingdom staring down all the ages that came after. Let us linger a while longer in the age of the pyramids, because it is the most astonishing thing Egypt ever did, and it rewards a slow and wondering look. Stand again in your mind at the foot of the Great Pyramid at Giza, in the days when it was new, not the bare weathered stone we know today, but the finished monument, cased all over in polished white limestone so smooth and bright that it blazed in the sun like a mountain of light, its capstone perhaps sheathed in gold, visible for miles across the desert, the most dazzling object in the world. How did they do it? That is the question everyone asks, and the answer, when you truly grasp it, is more staggering than any myth of lost magic or impossible machines. They did it with almost nothing, with copper tools soft enough to bend, with wooden sledges and ropes, with ramps of rubble and mud, with water and sand, and with the organized labor of tens of thousands of human beings, working together with a discipline and skill that would not be matched for thousands of years. There was no secret. There was only an ocean of patient, backbreaking, brilliantly organized human effort, so vast in scale that it is almost harder to believe than magic would be. The stone came from quarries, cut by hand. In the quarries, workers pounded and chiseled the soft limestone free with copper tools and stone hammers, and for the harder granite from the far south, they used an ingenious trick, grinding through the rock with sand, pouring hard sand beneath a copper saw or drill, so that it was the sand, not the metal, that slowly wore the stone away, grain by grain, over days of patient labor. The great blocks, some weighing many tons, were levered onto wooden sledges and dragged, by teams of men hauling on ropes, pouring water on the sand before the sledge to make it glide more easily, a technique the Egyptians actually depicted on their own walls. In the flood season, the risen river carried the stone by boat almost to the foot of the plateau, and then, block by block, the mountain rose, hauled up long ramps of earth and rubble that climbed alongside the growing pyramid, each stone dragged into place and set with astonishing precision, the whole vast structure rising course by course toward the sky over years and years of labor. And who were they? The builders. Not slaves, as the old story so often claims. That is a myth, and the evidence against it is clear and moving. Beside the pyramids, archaeologists found the builders' own town, their bakeries and breweries, their food stores, and most tellingly, their cemetery, where the workers were given honorable burials near the very monument they had raised, an honor no slave would ever have received. Their skeletons show injuries that had been carefully set and healed by physicians, broken bones mended, even signs of surgery survived, proof that these laborers were cared for, valued, treated when they were hurt. They ate well, including meat, which was costly, and they organized themselves into work gangs with proud names, scrawled in paint inside the monuments. Names like the Friends of Khufu, crews of men who took pride in their labor and competed with one another. They were, it seems, a mix of skilled permanent craftsmen and a great rotating workforce of ordinary Egyptian farmers, called up to labor on the king's monument during the flood season when their fields lay under water and there was no farming to be done. It was hard labor, brutally hard under a blazing sun, but it was labor for the god-king, believed to earn a share in his immortality, and it was fed and housed and honored, not driven by the whip. Picture the scale of it. A whole temporary city of workers at the foot of the plateau, thousands upon thousands of them, the bakeries turning out bread by the tens of thousands of loaves, the brewers making the thick, nourishing beer that was part of every worker's daily ration, the gangs hauling on the ropes in the sun with their work songs, the ramps swarming with laboring men, and the great white mountain climbing, day by day, year by year, toward the sky. It was the largest and most organized human undertaking the world had ever seen. And they did it not once but again and again, pyramid after pyramid, in the great confident dawn of Egyptian civilization. When you stand before the pyramids today, worn and bare and brown with age, that is what you are truly looking at. Not a mystery, but a monument to what human beings can do when a whole civilization bends its entire strength toward a single dream. They wanted to build a stairway to the stars, to carry their god-king into eternity, and to stand forever as proof that they had lived and been great. And in that, at least, they succeeded beyond anything they could have imagined. 4,500 years later, the stairway still stands, and we are still gazing up at it, still saying the names of the kings who built it. They reached for immortality, and in the only way that was ever truly possible, they found it. Let us go back once more to the very beginning of Egypt's greatness, to the Old Kingdom, and dwell there a little longer. For it was the first flowering of the civilization, the age that set the pattern for everything that followed, and it holds wonders beyond even the great pyramids. This was the age when the idea of the god-king reached its fullest and purest form. The pharaoh of the Old Kingdom was not merely a ruler. He was a living god walking the earth, the son of the sun, the one being who stood between humankind and the divine, upon whom the order of the entire universe was believed to depend. His word was law, his person sacred, his power over the land and its people absolute. When he spoke, it was a god speaking. When he acted, the cosmos itself was kept in balance. And when he died, he did not simply pass away, he ascended, becoming one with the gods, joining the eternal cycle of the heavens. Everything about the Old Kingdom, its pyramids above all, flowed from this overwhelming idea that Egypt was ruled by a god, and that the whole strength of the kingdom existed to serve and glorify and immortalize that god-king. To build the pyramids, this god-king commanded resources and labor on a scale that staggers the imagination. The whole of Egyptian society was organized, in a sense, around the project of the royal tomb, the quarrying and hauling of the stone, the feeding and housing of the workers, the vast administrative effort of coordinating tens of thousands of laborers, the accumulation of the wealth to pay for it all. It required a strong, centralized state, a capable bureaucracy of scribes and officials, and a population willing or compelled to give its labor to the god-king's eternal dream. That the Egyptians did this, not once but repeatedly, pyramid after pyramid, in the first few centuries of their civilization, is a measure of how powerful and confident and well-organized the Old Kingdom truly was. And beside the great pyramids at Giza, one of those god-kings left another wonder, one that has haunted the human imagination ever since: the Great Sphinx, carved from a single enormous outcrop of rock left in the quarry. It is a colossal figure with the body of a crouching lion and the face of a pharaoh, gazing eternally east toward the rising sun. It is one of the largest single-stone sculptures ever made, and one of the oldest monumental sculptures in the world, and it has sat there, keeping its silent watch over the plateau of the dead for 45 centuries. What it meant exactly to those who made it, we cannot fully know. A guardian of the sacred plateau, perhaps a fusion of the king with the power of the lion and the sun, a divine watcher set to guard the tombs of the god-kings for eternity. But its power over those who came after is beyond question. It sat and watched the sunrise for so many thousands of years that the desert itself rose up and buried it to the neck in sand, and later generations, gazing at the great head protruding from the dunes and no longer remembering who had made it or why, dug it out and wondered, and buried it again, and dug it out again, across the ages. There is a story of a prince, more than 1,000 years after the Sphinx was carved, itself already unimaginably ancient by then, who fell asleep in its shadow and dreamed that the Sphinx spoke to him, promising him the throne of Egypt if he would clear away the sand that choked it. He cleared it and became pharaoh, and recorded the dream on a stone he set between the great paws, where it stands to this day. Even to the ancient Egyptians, the Sphinx was a mystery from the deep past, a thing of legend, older than memory. But even the mighty old kingdom could not last forever, and its fall is one of the great cautionary tales of Egyptian history. The very thing that made it great, the enormous concentration of wealth and labor upon the god-king and his monuments, slowly hollowed it out from within. Generation after generation, the pharaohs poured the kingdom's riches into their tombs and into the perpetual estates and priesthoods established to maintain them. And slowly, power and wealth drained away from the throne. The great officials who governed the provinces grew rich and strong and began to pass their offices to their own sons, becoming a hereditary nobility with local power bases of their own, less and less dependent on the king. The god-king's absolute authority began, imperceptibly at first, to erode. And then, it seems, the earth itself turned against Egypt. The evidence suggests that the climate shifted, that for a long span of years, the life-giving flood of the Nile faltered and failed, that the waters came too low year after year, the fields went unwatered, the harvests failed, and famine crept across the land. A civilization built entirely upon the reliable flood was terribly exposed when the flood proved unreliable, and now it failed catastrophically. Hunger stalked the Black Land, and the God-King, whose whole claim to divine authority rested on his power to maintain the order of the world and the bounty of the river, was revealed as powerless before the failing flood. If the God-King could not make the river rise, what was he? The central authority collapsed. Egypt shattered into warring fragments, ruled by local lords fighting one another amid famine and disorder. The first great age of Egyptian civilization, the age of the pyramid builders, came to an end in hunger and chaos and the breakdown of the sacred order. The first fall, and a bitter lesson that not even the greatest of civilizations, not even a kingdom of god-kings and pyramids, was safe from collapse. Out of the long chaos, Egypt pulled itself back together. After generations of division and civil war, a powerful line of rulers from the south fought their way north, defeated their rivals, and reunited the two lands under a single crown once more. The kingdom was reborn, and the age that followed is the one we call the Middle Kingdom, Egypt's second great flowering, and in some ways its most admirable. The kings of this reborn Egypt were different from the remote, godlike pyramid builders of old. The collapse had taught hard lessons. These pharaohs presented themselves less as unreachable gods and more as shepherds of their people, hard-working rulers responsible for the welfare of ordinary Egyptians. They were vigorous and practical. They reformed the government to check the power of the local lords who had torn the kingdom apart. They undertook great public works, not just tombs, but irrigation projects that reclaimed vast tracts of marshland for farming, expanding the wealth of the whole country. They pushed Egypt's borders south, up the river into Nubia, securing trade routes and gold mines, and built great fortresses to guard the frontier. They made Egypt strong and prosperous and orderly again. And it was a golden age of culture. The Middle Kingdom is remembered as the classical age of Egyptian literature, the period whose language and stories and poetry later Egyptians studied as the finest their civilization had produced, the way we might look back on a golden age of our own literature. It was a confident, creative, well-governed time when Egypt, having fallen and learned from the fall, rebuilt itself into something perhaps wiser than before. For about 2 centuries, the reborn kingdom flourished. But Egypt's great protection had always been its isolation, the deserts and the sea that walled it off from the outside world. And that isolation was beginning, slowly, to fail. Over time, peoples from the lands to the northeast, beyond the Sinai, migrated into the fertile delta of Lower Egypt, settling there in growing numbers. The Egyptians called these foreigners the Hyksos, the rulers of foreign lands. And as the Middle Kingdom's strength faded, as its later kings grew weaker and the central power frayed once again, these foreign settlers in the north grew powerful enough to do something unprecedented in Egyptian history. They took over. For the first time, Egypt, or at least the whole of the north, fell under the rule of foreign kings. The Hyksos established their own dynasty in the Delta, ruling Lower Egypt as pharaohs in their own right, while the native Egyptian rulers were pushed back and confined to the south. To the proud Egyptians, who had always seen themselves as the center of the ordered world and everyone beyond their borders as chaotic barbarians, this was a profound humiliation and trauma. Their sacred land, the Black Land, ruled in part by foreigners. It was Egypt's second great fall, not this time a collapse into internal chaos, but a conquest from outside, the thing the deserts had always protected them against, now come to pass. And yet, as always with Egypt, the fall carried the seeds of a greater rise. The Hyksos, for all the wound they dealt to Egyptian pride, brought new things with them, new technologies that the isolated Egyptians had never possessed. They brought the horse and the war chariot, a fast and terrifying weapon of war. They brought stronger bows, better bronze weapons, new tools of battle. And the Egyptians, chafing under foreign rule in their southern stronghold, learned these new arts of war from their conquerors, and then turned them against them. In the south, at the city of Thebes, a line of native Egyptian princes began the long fight to drive the foreigners out and reunite the land. It was a war of liberation, fought over generations, and it burned in the Egyptian memory as a sacred struggle to restore the proper order of the world. The Theban kings, now armed with chariots and the new weapons of war, pushed north against the Hyksos, battle by battle, king by king, driving toward the Delta and the foreign dynasty entrenched there. At last, a warrior pharaoh completed the work, smashing the Hyksos' power, storming their strongholds, and expelling the foreign rulers from Egypt entirely, chasing them out of the Delta and back into the lands beyond the frontier. The two lands were united once more, under a native Egyptian crown, and the trauma of foreign rule was ended. But something had changed forever in the Egyptian soul. They had been invaded. Their sacred isolation had been broken, and they resolved that it would never happen again, that never again would they wait passively behind their deserts for an enemy to come to them. Instead, they would go out and meet their enemies far beyond their borders. They would build an empire. And so, out of the humiliation of the Hyksos and the fury of the war to expel them, Egypt entered its third and greatest age. The age when it would cease to be merely a kingdom along a river and become the dominant superpower of the entire ancient world. The age of the new kingdom. The age of empire. The age of the pharaohs whose names still ring loudest across the centuries. The warrior queens and conquering kings and heretics and boy kings who would carry Egypt to a height of power and glory it had never known before and never would again. The Middle Kingdom deserves a longer pause than we gave it, because it is, in many ways, the most quietly admirable of all Egypt's great ages. The proof that this civilization possessed a gift given to almost no other, the power to rise, whole and renewed, from its own collapse. For after the fall of the Old Kingdom, Egypt endured a long, dark, bitter time of division and suffering. Generations of civil war, famine, and chaos. The land broken into warring fragments, the sacred order shattered, the proud civilization of the pyramid builders reduced to hunger and disorder. The Egyptians who lived through it, and those who remembered it afterward, regarded it with horror, as a time when the whole world had turned upside down, when the certainties of life had dissolved. Writings survive from around this age, or looking back on it, that lament the overturning of all order. The poor become rich, and the rich poor, the land gripped by violence and despair, the gods seemingly absent. It was Egypt's dark night, and it lasted a long time. And then, out of that darkness, Egypt pulled itself back together. Powerful rulers arose in the south, in the region of the city that would become the great capital of the empire. And over long struggle, they fought their way north, defeated their rivals, and reunited the two lands under a single crown once more. The kingdom was reborn, and the kings who rebuilt it had been changed by the catastrophe. They had seen what happened when the god-king's authority failed, and the land fell into ruin, and they ruled with a new seriousness, a new sense of responsibility, a new awareness of the fragility of the order they maintained. The pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom present themselves differently from their Old Kingdom predecessors, where the pyramid builders had been remote, absolute, unreachable gods. The kings of the Middle Kingdom often show themselves as careful, hard-working, even careworn rulers, conscious of the heavy burden of kingship and the responsibility to protect and provide for their people. Their statues sometimes show them not as serene, ageless gods, but as older men with lined, weary, thoughtful faces, marked by the cares of rule, a striking and humane change. A king who looks like a man carrying a great weight. They saw themselves, in part, as shepherds of their people, responsible for the welfare of ordinary Egyptians, and much of their effort went not into monuments to their own glory, but into the practical work of good government. They were vigorous and effective. They reformed the administration to bring the powerful provincial nobles, whose independence had helped destroy the Old Kingdom, back under royal control. They undertook great practical works, most impressively, a massive project to reclaim a large, marshy lake region, draining and irrigating it to create vast new tracts of rich farmland, expanding the wealth and food supply of the whole kingdom. They secured the frontiers, pushing south into Nubia and building a chain of mighty fortresses to guard the border and control the trade in gold and goods from the south. They restored Egypt to strength, stability, and prosperity, and they did it thoughtfully, with an eye to lasting order rather than mere glory. And under this stable, prosperous, well-governed kingdom, Egyptian culture reached one of its highest flowerings. The Middle Kingdom is remembered as the classical age of Egyptian literature, the period whose language became the model of fine writing for all later ages, the way the literature of a golden age becomes the standard against which everything after is measured. It was in this age that many of the greatest works of Egyptian literature were composed. Adventure tales and travelers' stories, wisdom texts and instructions on how to live well, poems and hymns and reflections on life and death and the nature of a good society. Later Egyptian schoolboys, for 1,000 years afterward, would study and copy out the classics of the Middle Kingdom as the finest examples of their language and thought. It was a confident, humane, creative age, Egypt, having fallen into ruin and clawed its way back, rebuilding itself into something perhaps wiser and more thoughtful than the magnificent but rigid grandeur that had come before. The Middle Kingdom teaches the deepest lesson of the whole long Egyptian story, a lesson worth carrying gently towards sleep. Egypt fell more than once into darkness and ruin and despair, and Egypt rose again more than once renewed. Its greatness lay not only in its monuments and its conquests, but in this extraordinary resilience, this power to endure collapse and be reborn again and again across 3,000 years. Civilizations, like people, can fall into their dark nights and can, sometimes, come through them into a new morning. The Egyptians knew both the falling and the rising, and they left us the record of both, not just the glory, but the collapse and the patient, courageous rebuilding that followed. It is one of the most human things about them, and one of the most hopeful. Let us return and linger longer in the great age of empire, the new kingdom at its height, because it was the summit of Egyptian power and produced some of the most extraordinary rulers the civilization ever knew. and their stories deserve more than a passing glance here in the quiet. Remember how it began, in trauma and humiliation. The Hyksos, the foreign rulers, had seized the north and ruled part of Egypt, and the shock of that foreign domination changed the Egyptian character forever. When the warrior princes of the south finally drove the foreigners out and reunited the land, they resolved that Egypt would never again wait passively behind its deserts for an enemy to arrive. The best defense, they decided, was to strike first and strike far, to push Egypt's borders out into the world and meet any threat far from the sacred soil of the Nile. And so peaceful, inward-looking old Egypt became, for the first time, an aggressive military power, an empire builder, its armies marching out year after year into the lands beyond its frontiers. They built a professional army unlike anything Egypt had fielded before, masses of infantry, archers, and above all the war chariots learned from the Hyksos, now perfected into Egypt's elite striking force. Light, fast, 2-horse chariots carrying a driver and an archer, sweeping across the battlefield, the tanks of the ancient world. With this army, the pharaohs of the New Kingdom carved out an empire that stretched north through the lands of the eastern Mediterranean coast, deep into Syria, and far south up the Nile into Nubia, subduing kingdoms and city-states, planting garrisons, and forcing the conquered to send a yearly river of tribute back to Egypt: gold and silver, timber and precious stones, horses and cattle, exotic goods and captured slaves. The wealth of a whole conquered world flowed up the Nile, and Egypt grew richer than any kingdom the earth had yet seen. We have met the two greatest figures of this imperial dawn, but they are worth knowing more fully. There was Hatshepsut, the woman who made herself king, and it is worth pausing on just how extraordinary that was. Egypt's whole ideology of kingship was built around the pharaoh as a male god, the living embodiment of the falcon god Horus. For a woman to claim that role was to defy the deepest assumptions of the entire civilization. And yet Hatshepsut did it and made it work and ruled successfully for 2 decades, not through war, but through a brilliant reign of trade, wealth, and monumental building. She sent her famous expedition to a distant, half-legendary southern land, its ships returning laden with incense trees, ebony, ivory, gold, exotic animals and treasures. A voyage of exploration and commerce she was so proud of that she covered the walls of her exquisite terraced temple with its story. She presented herself in the full regalia of a male king, even the ceremonial beard, not from any confusion about who she was, but because the office itself was defined as male, and she was claiming the office whole. She was one of the most successful and remarkable rulers in the entire history of Egypt, and her reward, after death, was to have her successor try to erase her from history entirely, chiseling her name and image from her monuments, so that she was nearly lost to memory for thousands of years before modern scholars restored her to her rightful place. And there was the man who may have ordered that erasure, her stepson, Thutmose III, who grew up in her shadow, and then, upon taking sole power, became the greatest warrior pharaoh Egypt ever produced. A general so gifted and so relentless that later historians would call him the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. Where Hatshepsut had built and traded, Thutmose conquered. He led campaign after campaign, year after year, 17 campaigns over 2 decades, marching his army out each season to extend and secure the empire, and he did not lose. His masterstroke came early, at the very start of his solo reign, when he faced a great coalition of rebellious cities gathered against him. Marching to meet them, he came to a mountain range with 3 passes through it, 2 safe and broad, 1 narrow and treacherous, so tight his army would have to go through in single file, dangerously exposed. His generals begged him to take a safe road. Thutmose reasoned that the enemy, thinking exactly as his generals did, would guard the easy roads and leave the dangerous one open. And so he took the dangerous pass, precisely because it was the one no sane commander would choose. He led his army through the defile, emerged onto the plain behind the astonished enemy, and won a crushing victory that shattered the coalition and confirmed Egyptian dominance over the whole region for generations. It was a stroke of exactly the kind of daring, unexpected genius that marks the greatest commanders in history, and it set the pattern for a career of conquest that carried Egypt to the very height of its imperial power. When the new kingdom rose and the wealth of an empire came flooding into Egypt, the pharaohs poured that wealth, above all, into the houses of the gods, building temples on a scale so vast that their ruins still overwhelm every visitor who stands among them today. If the pyramids were the great achievement of the Old Kingdom, the temples were the glory of the new. And no story of Egypt is complete without wandering, for a while, among their columns in the dark. The greatest of them grew at the heart of the empire's capital, on the east bank of the river, an immense complex of temples that expanded over many centuries as pharaoh after pharaoh added to it, each king raising new halls and gateways and obelisks to outdo his predecessors, until it became the largest religious building the ancient world ever produced, and one of the largest ever built by human hands. To walk into its great hall was to enter a forest of stone, rows upon rows of gigantic columns, so massive that 100 men could stand on the top of the largest of them, rose up into the shadows far overhead, their capitals spreading like the flowers of a colossal papyrus marsh turned to stone. The columns were carved from top to bottom and painted in brilliant colors, and the ceiling far above was painted deep blue and spangled with golden stars, so that a worshipper walking through the dim hall moved as if through a primeval forest beneath a night sky, in the very presence of the gods. Even in ruin, even with the colors long faded and the roof long gone, that hall of giant columns silences everyone who enters it. In its glory, lit by shafts of sun and the glow of lamps, it must have been overwhelming beyond words. But the temple was not, like our churches, a place for crowds to gather and worship. It was the literal house of the god, the dwelling place on earth of the divine, and its innermost heart was a place of deep secrecy and darkness. Ordinary people never entered the temple's inner rooms. They gathered in the outer courts or outside the walls entirely. The deeper one went into the temple, the darker, the smaller, the more sacred the chambers became, until at the very center, in a small dark shrine at the heart of the vast complex, dwelt the god itself, in the form of a sacred statue, kept in a shrine, tended in darkness. And there, each day, the priests performed the sacred rituals that kept the world in order. Every morning, the high priest, purified and robed, would enter the innermost shrine, break the seal on the god's chamber, and attend to the divine statue as one would attend to a living king, waking it, washing it, anointing it with oils, dressing it in fresh linen, offering it food and drink, burning incense before it, singing the ancient hymns. For the Egyptians believed that these daily rituals were not mere ceremony. They were the very thing that kept the sun rising and the river flooding and the whole ordered universe from collapsing back into the primeval chaos. The priests in their dark temples were quite literally maintaining the cosmos, day by day, offering by offering. The wealth of the empire flowed into these temples and their priesthoods to fund that endless sacred work, and over time made the priesthood so rich and powerful that they became a force able to rival the pharaoh himself, a tension that would shape the whole later history of Egypt. Yet the people were not shut out entirely from their gods, for on the great festival days, and there were many scattered through the Egyptian year, the god came out to them. On these days of celebration, the sacred statue was lifted from its dark shrine, placed within a magnificent portable shrine shaped like a boat, and carried out of the temple on the shoulders of the priests in a great joyful procession, so that the god might travel to visit another temple or sail upon the river or show itself to the people. And on those days, the whole population poured out to celebrate. There was music and dancing and singing in the streets. There was feasting and enormous quantities of beer and general rejoicing. Great crowds lined the processional ways to glimpse the god's shrine passing by, borne aloft in clouds of incense, and to call out their prayers and questions. For on these days, the god was believed to give oracles, answering the pleas of ordinary people. The festivals were the great highlights of the Egyptian year, days when the sacred and the joyful came together, when the hidden god walked among the people, when the whole community celebrated the bonds between the human and the divine. Beneath all the grandeur of pharaohs and temples, this was religion as ordinary Egyptians lived it. Not fear, but celebration. Not distance, but a god who, on the appointed days, came out into the sunlight to be among his people. Among all the achievements of ancient Egypt, few are more beautiful or more important than its writing. The elegant, intricate picture script we call hieroglyphs, which covered the walls of every temple and tomb, which recorded so many centuries of a civilization's life, and which fell silent for 2 millennia before being deciphered again in modern times. It is worth drifting, as the night deepens, through the world of Egyptian writing, for it was one of the keys to everything the civilization became. The Egyptians themselves called their writing the words of the gods, and they believed it a divine gift given to humankind by the god of wisdom, the ibis-headed lord of knowledge. And their script was unlike anything else in the ancient world. A system of hundreds of exquisite little pictures, images of birds and animals, of people and parts of the body, of plants and tools and vessels, and abstract symbols, arranged in careful rows and columns. Some of these signs stood for the things they depicted. Some stood for sounds, like the letters of an alphabet. Some stood for whole ideas or categories. It was a rich, complex, and beautiful system, capable of expressing anything the language could say, and it was written to be lovely as well as legible. For the Egyptians, writing was an art, and a well-carved inscription was a thing of beauty, painted in brilliant colors, arranged with careful attention to grace and balance. But to the Egyptians, writing was more than communication. It held power, real, magical power. To write something was, in a sense, to make it real, to give it permanence and force. To carve a person's name upon a monument was to secure their memory and their existence for eternity. To erase that name was to attack their very being. To write the offerings a dead person would need in the afterlife was to ensure they would have them forever, whether or not any living hand ever provided them. The spells written on tomb walls and in the sacred books of the dead were not mere descriptions. They were active magic, their power residing in the very act of their writing. Words written reached into reality and shaped it. And so the Egyptians treated their sacred script with reverence, and those who could wield it, the scribes, held a place of honor and power in their society. To be a scribe was to hold one of the most prized positions in Egypt. In a world where the vast majority of people could neither read nor write, the mastery of the hundreds of complex signs of the script was a rare and precious skill. One, through long years of hard schooling, that opened the door to a life of comfort, respect, and advancement. The scribe was exempt from the brutal manual labor that filled most lives. He could rise to become an administrator, an official, a manager of estates or temples or armies, even a great officer of state. The Egyptians wrote texts urging young men to devote themselves to the scribble art, praising the clean and honored life of the scribe above every other trade, contrasting his comfort with the misery of the farmer at the mercy of the flood, the soldier marching to his death, the craftsman toiling in heat and dust and danger. Be a scribe, these texts urged. It is the greatest of all callings, for the scribe directs the work of every other man, and his words endure. The pen, the Egyptians understood, was mightier and more lasting than the plow or the sword. And they were right. in a way they could not have foreseen. For it was through their writing that ancient Egypt ultimately survived. The kingdoms fell, the gods were forgotten, the language died on living tongues, but the words remained, carved in stone, waiting. And when at last, thousands of years later, the lost script was deciphered once more, it was those words, those beautiful sacred signs, that gave Egypt back its voice, that let the long-dead pharaohs and gods and ordinary people speak again across the immense gulf of time. The scribes had believed that their words would endure and preserve the memory of their civilization forever. And across 3,000 years and more, against every odds, their words did exactly that. We hear ancient Egypt speak today because its scribes wrote it down, and because their beautiful words, patient in the stone, outlasted everything. We think of the Egyptians for their tombs and their gods, but they were also, for their age, a people of remarkable knowledge and skill. Practical, careful observers of the world, who made discoveries and developed arts that laid foundations others would build on for thousands of years. As the night deepens, it is worth drifting for a while through the quieter glory of what these people knew and could do. They were, first of all, masters of measurement and building, as their monuments prove beyond any doubt. To raise structures as vast and precise as the pyramids and temples, they had to be skilled surveyors and engineers, able to lay out perfect right angles and level foundations across great distances, to align enormous buildings to the points of the compass and to the movements of the stars with astonishing accuracy. They developed a practical mathematics to serve this work and to manage the affairs of their kingdom. Arithmetic and geometry used to survey the fields after each flood erased the boundaries, to calculate the amount of grain in a store or the number of bricks in a ramp, to divide shares and reckon taxes and plan the cutting of stone. Their methods were practical rather than abstract, but they were effective enough to build wonders. They were patient watchers of the heavens, too. Living beneath the clear desert skies, night after night, the Egyptian priests studied the stars and mapped their movements. And from that patient watching, they created one of the great practical achievements of the ancient world, a calendar. They noticed that a certain bright star reappeared in the dawn sky at the same time each year, just before the annual flood began. And by that heavenly clock, they divided the year into 3 seasons and 12 months and 365 days. A solar calendar so sound that it became, in refined form, the ancestor of the very calendar the world still uses today. When you look at the date, you are, in a distant way, using a system the priests of Egypt worked out by watching the stars wheel over the desert thousands of years ago. And they were, for their time, remarkable healers. Egyptian physicians were famous throughout the ancient world, their services sought even by foreign kings. Their long practice of preserving the dead had given them an unusual knowledge of the human body, and their doctors developed real medical skill, setting and splinting broken bones, treating wounds, performing minor surgery, and compounding an enormous array of remedies from herbs and minerals and other substances. Surviving medical texts, written thousands of years ago, describe injuries and diseases and their treatments with careful, practical observation, examining a patient, making a diagnosis, and prescribing a course of treatment in a way that begins, in places, to resemble the methods of medicine itself. Much of their medicine was still bound up with magic and spells, as all ancient medicine was, but woven through, it was a foundation of genuine, hard-won, practical knowledge of the body and its ailments, far ahead of most of the ancient world. They wrote poetry and love songs and stories and words of wisdom, advice from fathers to sons on how to live a good and successful life, some of which reads, across the gulf of thousands of years, as gentle and sensible as anything written since. They made music, on harps and flutes and drums and rattles. They created art of extraordinary beauty and power, governed by strict and ancient rules, yet capable of astonishing grace and life. The painted tombs, the exquisite jewelry, the serene and perfect statues of their gods and kings. This was not a crude or primitive people. This was one of the most sophisticated, skilled, and knowledgeable civilizations of the ancient world. And much of what later peoples, the Greeks especially, would learn and build upon. They learned, in part, from the accumulated wisdom of the ancient land of the Nile. The Greeks themselves looked upon Egypt with awe, as a place of unimaginable antiquity and hidden wisdom, and traveled there to learn. Egypt was old when Greece was young, and its knowledge, like its monuments, cast a long shadow across the ages. We touched, earlier, on the strangest episode in all of Egyptian history, the heretic king who tried to overthrow the ancient gods. But it is worth returning to and dwelling in, because it is one of the most fascinating human dramas the ancient world has left us. The story of a pharaoh who tried, by sheer force of will, to change the very soul of his civilization, and of the extraordinary family at the heart of it. He came to the throne as a conventional prince, at the height of the empire's wealth and power, heir to the richest kingdom on earth. And then, gradually or suddenly, we cannot be sure, he underwent something like a religious revolution in his own soul. He came to believe, with the burning conviction of a true visionary, in a single god above all others. Not the hidden god Ammon, whose priests had grown so rich and powerful, not the vast old family of Egyptian gods, but the visible disk of the sun itself, blazing in the sky, the giver of all life, whose rays reached down to touch and nourish every living thing. And he set out to reshape all of Egypt around this single radiant god. He changed his own name to declare his devotion to the sun disk. He proclaimed himself the sole intermediary between this one god and all humankind, the only one who could truly know or approach the divine. He raised the worship of his god above all others, and in time moved to suppress the old gods altogether, closing their temples, cutting off the wealth of their priesthoods, even sending workers across Egypt to hack the name of the old chief god out of monuments everywhere it appeared. And most dramatically of all, he turned his back on the ancient capital and its entrenched priesthood entirely, and built, from nothing, in the empty desert on a virgin site, a brand new capital city dedicated wholly to his one god, a gleaming city of temples open to the sky, so that the sun's rays could pour down directly upon the offerings, unlike the dark, hidden shrines of the old religion. He moved the entire royal court there, into the middle of nowhere, to worship the sun. And something remarkable happened to Egyptian art in his strange new city. For thousands of years, Egyptian art had followed rigid, sacred conventions. The pharaoh always shown as an idealized, ageless, superhuman figure, stiff and perfect and eternal. But in the heretic king's reign, the art broke free into something startlingly new and intimate. The king had himself and his family depicted in ways no pharaoh had ever permitted, not as remote perfect gods, but as living human beings with oddly elongated, almost strange bodies, in tender, informal domestic scenes. The royal family relaxing together, the king and queen playing with their little daughters, kissing them, dandling them on their knees, the whole family bathed in the life-giving rays of their sun god, whose beams ended in little hands reaching down to caress them. There is a warmth and humanity in this art, unlike anything else in 3 millennia of Egyptian history. A royal family shown loving one another in the sunlight. It is one of the most unexpected and beautiful things the whole strange episode produced. And at the king's side stood his queen, whose name has become one of the most famous in all of Egyptian history, and whose face is perhaps the most recognized image the ancient world has left us. She was Nefertiti. Her name means, fittingly, the beautiful one has come, and she was no mere consort. She appears everywhere beside her husband, sharing in his revolution, worshipping the sun god at his side, depicted in some scenes with a prominence and power that suggest she was very nearly his equal, a full partner in the great religious experiment. A single sculpted portrait head of her, discovered in the ruins of the workshop of a royal sculptor in the abandoned desert city, has become world famous. A bust of such extraordinary grace and beauty, the long, elegant neck, the serene, perfect features, the calm gaze, that it is considered one of the masterpieces of ancient art, and has made Nefertiti, 30 centuries after her death, an enduring symbol of beauty itself. And yet, for all her fame, she remains a mystery. At some point, she vanishes from the record, and we do not know what became of her, whether she died, or fell from favor, or perhaps even ruled in her own right for a time under another name after her husband's death. Like so much of this strange episode, she flickers brilliantly and then is lost in shadow. For the great experiment did not survive its creator. It had been imposed from the top, by one man's will, upon a civilization that had believed the old things for 2 millennia and had never wanted them overthrown. The people clung to their old gods in their hearts. The dispossessed priesthood seethed, and while the king was lost in his religious visions in his desert city, the great empire abroad, neglected, began to fray. Desperate letters survive from loyal vassals in the Egyptian territories of the Near East, begging the distant pharaoh for the military help against their enemies that seems never to have come. When the heretic king at last died, his revolution collapsed almost at once. The court abandoned the desert city and returned to the ancient capital. The old gods were restored, their temples reopened, their priesthood returned to power. The gleaming new city was left to the sand and forgotten, and later generations, remembering the whole episode with horror as a time of heresy and neglect, struck the heretic king's name from the official lists, tore down his monuments, and did their best to erase him from history, so that this most fascinating of all pharaohs became, for thousands of years, almost entirely forgotten, recovered only in modern times from the ruins of the city he built and the wreckage of the revolution he failed to make. And the task of healing the wound he had torn, of leading Egypt back to its old gods and its old ways, fell, as we have seen, to a young boy, his own son, most likely, a child who would become, by the strangest of accidents, the most famous pharaoh the world would ever know. The task of putting the world back together fell, strangely, to a child. The heretic king was succeeded, after a brief interval, by a young boy, his own son, most likely, who came to the throne at around 9 years old, in the middle of the chaos his father had unleashed. We have met this boy before, on another night. His name was Tutankhamun. It was in his reign, guided by the powerful officials who ruled in the child king's name, that Egypt formally turned its back on the heresy and restored the old gods to their rightful place. The temples were repaired, the old worship renewed, the capital returned to its ancient home, and the boy king's very name was changed to honor the restored chief god of old, a living monument in a child to the putting right of the world. He reigned only briefly and died while still young, a minor king in the great sweep of Egyptian history, and was buried hastily in a small tomb. And that tomb, forgotten and hidden by an accident of rubble, would sleep untouched for over 3,000 years, until its discovery in modern times made this obscure boy king, of all the pharaohs, the most famous in the world. But we have told that story fully on another night. Here he is simply the child who healed the wound his father had torn, and handed a restored and reunited Egypt to the pharaohs who would follow. And the greatest of those who followed was coming soon, a pharaoh who would rule for an astonishing span of years, cover Egypt in more colossal monuments than any king before or since, fight one of the most famous battles of the ancient world, and come to be remembered simply as the Great. Under him, Egypt would blaze up one final time into its last age of true imperial glory, before the long twilight began. His name was Ramesses II, and history remembers him as Ramesses the Great. perhaps the most famous pharaoh of them all, the very image of the mighty Egyptian god-king, and in many ways the last great blaze of the New Kingdom's glory before its long decline. He ruled for an extraordinary length of time, around 66 years, an almost unimaginable reign in the ancient world, so long that many of his subjects lived their entire lives and died having known no other pharaoh. He was a king who seemed almost eternal, and he used his endless reign to stamp his name and image across the whole of Egypt on a scale no pharaoh had ever attempted. He built more monuments, more temples, more colossal statues of himself than any king in Egyptian history, until his face and his name were everywhere, carved into the very bones of the country. His greatest monument was a temple cut directly into a mountainside far up the river, its entrance guarded by 4 gigantic seated statues of himself, each towering many times the height of a man, gazing out across the land for eternity. He fathered a vast number of children. He outlived many of his own heirs. He was, by any measure, the most prolific and self-glorifying builder Egypt ever produced, and he made himself the very definition of what a great pharaoh should be. Let us return to Ramesses the Great, and to the battle that he made the most famous event of his long reign, because it is one of the best documented battles of the entire ancient world, and its story is a remarkable one, full of danger, deception, and a young king's desperate courage. Early in his reign, the young and ambitious Ramesses set out to challenge the other great superpower of the age, the Hittite Empire, for control of the rich lands of Syria that lay between the two powers. He marched north at the head of a great army, divided into 4 divisions, tens of thousands of men and thousands of chariots, aiming for a strategic city that both empires coveted. And as he approached, the trap was set, though Ramesses did not know it. The Hittite king had brought an enormous army of his own, and had hidden it, cleverly, behind the city out of sight. And he sent spies to Ramesses, disguised as deserters, who fed the Egyptian king false information, telling him that the Hittite army was still far away, hundreds of miles to the north, nowhere near. Ramesses, believing the enemy distant, made a fateful decision. Eager to reach the city, he pressed ahead rapidly with only his lead division and his personal guard, racing far out in front of the rest of his army, which was strung out for miles behind him on the march. He set up his camp near the city with only a fraction of his force, his other divisions hours away, still crossing the river, still marching up. He had walked, blind, into the jaws of the trap. Then the truth broke upon him. Egyptian scouts captured 2 more enemy spies and, under interrogation, forced the truth out of them. The entire Hittite army was not far away at all. It was right there, massed and hidden just beyond the city, poised to strike. And even as Ramesses grasped the horror of his situation, the blow fell. The Hittite king unleashed his chariots, thousands of them, in a massive surprise assault. They smashed across the river, tore into one of Ramesses' divisions still on the march, shattering it, sending the survivors fleeing in panic toward the king's camp. And then the tide of enemy chariots swept on toward the camp itself, where Ramesses stood with only his household troops, suddenly and almost completely surrounded by an overwhelming enemy force, cut off from the bulk of his army, in mortal danger of being killed or captured on the field. It was the kind of catastrophe that ended kings and lost empires. By every reasonable measure, Ramesses was beaten, trapped, outnumbered, his army scattered, the enemy chariots closing in around him. And here the account he later carved across the walls of Egypt takes on the tone of legend. Abandoned, he claimed, by his terrified men, the young pharaoh called upon his god, mounted his chariot, and hurled himself personally into the enemy again and again, fighting with superhuman courage at the very front of the desperate struggle, holding the enemy off by his own valor while his camp fought for its life around him. Whatever the exact truth of the king's personal heroics, the battle was saved by two things. First, the desperate resistance at the camp bought time. And second, at the critical moment, a force of elite Egyptian troops arrived unexpectedly from another direction, falling upon the flank of the Hittite chariots just as they, thinking the battle won, had broken off to plunder the Egyptian camp. Caught by surprise in their turn, the Hittite chariots were thrown into confusion and cut down, driven back against the river. And then Ramesses' other divisions, hurrying up at last from the march, arrived on the field, and the tide turned. The Hittite chariots, battered and disordered, were driven back across the river in disorder, many drowning as they fled. By the end of the day, Ramesses had escaped the trap and bloodied the enemy badly, snatching survival and something like victory from the jaws of total disaster. In truth, the battle was probably closer to a draw than the crushing triumph Ramesses claimed. Neither side truly won. The contested city stayed in Hittite hands. The two great empires had simply fought each other to a bloody standstill. But Ramesses returned home and proclaimed it a mighty victory won by his own personal heroism, and had the story carved in enormous, triumphant detail across the walls of temple after temple throughout Egypt. The most thoroughly recorded battle in the entire ancient world, and one of the greatest exercises in royal self-promotion ever undertaken. And in a way, it worked, for we remember it still. And there was a further, quieter triumph to come. Some years later, exhausted by their long rivalry and wary of new threats rising elsewhere, Egypt and the Hittites made peace, concluding a formal treaty of alliance and mutual aid. One of the earliest peace treaties in recorded history, a copy of which was proudly displayed in Egypt, and which endured for the rest of both kings' reigns. The greatest chariot battle of the ancient world ended, in time, not in conquest, but in the two exhausted giants agreeing, at last, to lay down their arms. The pharaohs of the great imperial age faced a problem their pyramid-building ancestors had bequeathed to them, and their solution created one of the most famous places in all of Egypt. The problem was robbery. The Great Pyramids, for all their size and majesty, had one fatal flaw as tombs. They were enormous signposts. Each one announced to the world, and to every thief, exactly where a king lay buried with his treasure. And one by one, over the centuries, every single pyramid had been broken into and robbed, the sacred dead disturbed, the treasures carried off. The whole point of the tomb, to preserve the king's body and wealth for eternity, had failed again and again, precisely because the tombs were so visible. So the pharaohs of the new kingdom tried the opposite approach. Instead of building up toward the sky in monuments that shouted their presence, they dug down in secret in a remote and hidden place. Across the river from their capital, in the desert hills, they chose a lonely, barren valley, hemmed in by cliffs, hard to reach and easy to guard. And there, in secret, they cut their tombs deep into the living rock. Long, sloping passages and chambers driven far into the mountainside, decorated with sacred texts and images to guide the king through the underworld, filled with treasure, and then sealed and hidden and disguised, so that no thief would ever know a king lay beneath. This was the Valley of the Kings, and for centuries it served as the secret royal cemetery of the empire, the resting place of pharaoh after pharaoh, including the great Ramesses himself, and in a small and hastily prepared tomb, the boy king whose treasures would one day astonish the world. But hiding, it turned out, worked little better than building, for the thieves were patient and determined, and a secret shared by the workers who cut the tombs and the priests who tended them was not, in the end, a secret that could be kept forever. Over the centuries, as Egypt weakened and order frayed, the tomb robbers came to the Valley of the Kings too, breaking into the hidden royal tombs one after another, stripping them of their gold, disturbing the mummies of the pharaohs in their search for the treasures wrapped within the bandages. Records survive of the investigations and trials of these tomb robbers, of officials examining violated tombs, of confessions extracted, of the shock and scandal of the sacred royal dead being plundered. The hidden tombs, like the pyramids before them, were being emptied. And so, in the troubled later days of the New Kingdom, the priests did a remarkable and touching thing to save what remained of their kings. Recognizing that they could no longer protect the royal tombs from robbery, they undertook, in secret, to rescue the bodies of the pharaohs themselves. They entered the violated tombs, gathered up the mummies of the great kings, Ramesses the Great among them, and many other famous pharaohs of the empire, rewrapped and repaired the bodies that the robbers had damaged, and then carried them away in secret and hid them together in a few well-concealed caches. A hidden tomb in the cliffs, a secret chamber, where dozens of the greatest pharaohs of Egypt were laid together, quietly, to protect them from the thieves. There they lay, hidden and forgotten, for nearly so many centuries. And there, in modern times, they were found. When archaeologists at last discovered these hidden caches in the cliffs, they opened them to find, gathered together in the deep quiet, the actual bodies of the great pharaohs of Egypt's golden age, the very kings whose names filled the temple walls, the conquerors and builders and god-kings, their mummies preserved across an almost unimaginable span of years, rescued long ago by loyal priests and hidden away, now brought back into the light. It was one of the most astonishing discoveries in the history of archaeology. Not a statue or an image, but the actual faces of the pharaohs, the men themselves, Ramesses the Great and his fellow kings, gazing out of the linen across the immense gulf of time. There is something profoundly moving in it. These kings had wanted, above all things, to preserve their bodies forever, to live on eternally, to have their names spoken down the ages. Robbers had violated their tombs and scattered their treasures, but loyal priests had saved their bodies and hidden them. And so, in the end, across 3,000 years, the pharaohs had survived, not in the way they intended, not undisturbed in their golden tombs, but survived all the same, their faces preserved, their names recovered and spoken once more. They achieved, by a strange and winding path, exactly the immortality they had longed for. We know their names. We have seen their faces. And on a quiet night, thousands of years later, we are remembering them still. To understand how Egypt's great empire began to fade after Ramesses the Great, you have to understand that Egypt did not decline alone. It was caught in one of the most mysterious and terrible catastrophes in all of ancient history. A sudden, sweeping collapse that, within the span of a few decades, brought down nearly every great civilization of the age across a huge swath of the ancient world, and plunged the whole region into a dark age that lasted for generations. For centuries, the great powers of the Bronze Age had traded and warred and flourished together. Egypt, and the mighty Hittite Empire to the north, and the rich kingdoms and cities of the eastern Mediterranean, all bound together in a web of commerce and diplomacy, exchanging gold and copper and tin and grain, their kings writing letters to one another as brothers. It was an interconnected world, prosperous and sophisticated, that had endured for a very long time. And then, with terrifying speed, it fell apart. City after city, kingdom after kingdom, was destroyed, burned, abandoned, wiped out, in a wave of destruction that rolled across the ancient world. The great Hittite Empire, Egypt's mighty rival, simply collapsed and vanished from history. Ancient cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to ash and never rebuilt. Trade routes shattered. Writing itself was lost in some places. An entire glittering age of the world came crashing down. The Egyptians left us one of the few records we have of the catastrophe, and in it they named one of the forces behind the chaos, a confederation of raiders and displaced peoples that they called, simply, the Sea Peoples. Who exactly they were, where they came from, and why they came, remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of ancient history. They seem to have been not a single nation, but a great tide of different peoples on the move, driven, perhaps, by famine or drought, or the collapse of their own homelands, or some combination of disasters we still do not fully understand, migrating and raiding across the sea and along the coasts. Whole peoples on the move with their families and their possessions, destroying the settled kingdoms in their path and seeking new lands to settle. They came for Egypt too, in great waves, by land and by sea. This tide of peoples crashed against the borders of the Nile, threatening to overwhelm the ancient kingdom as it had overwhelmed so many others. And here Egypt's story might have ended, centuries early, swallowed like the Hittites into the darkness of the collapse. But Egypt, under the last of its warrior pharaohs, fought back with everything it had, in great and desperate battles on land, and in a furious sea battle fought in the mouths of the Nile. One of the earliest sea battles recorded in all of history. The Egyptians met the invaders, and at terrible cost, threw them back. The pharaoh recorded his hard-won victory in triumphant detail on his temple walls, depicting the great clash of ships. The invaders repelled from the sacred land. Egypt had survived, where nearly everyone else had fallen. The kingdom endured. But survival came at a devastating price. The wars against the sea peoples and the wider collapse of the whole interconnected world drained Egypt of its wealth and strength. The empire abroad, the foreign territories the great conquering pharaohs had won, slipped away for good, lost in the chaos, never to be regained. The flow of foreign gold and tribute that had made the new kingdom so fabulously rich dried up. At home, the treasury emptied, hard times came, and there are records from these years of the first labor strikes in recorded history. The workers who built the royal tombs laying down their tools because the state could no longer pay them in the grain they were owed, a small but telling sign of a kingdom running out of money and order. And as the crown grew poorer and weaker, the old pattern reasserted itself, power draining away from the pharaoh and into the hands of the priesthood, which had grown, over the centuries of lavish royal gifts, into the richest and most powerful institution in Egypt, controlling vast estates and treasuries and armies of dependents. In time, the high priests in the south came to rule as powers in their own right, all but independent of the pharaoh in the north. The single, unified kingdom fractured once more, as it had after the old and middle kingdoms, splitting between rival centers of power. The great new kingdom, the age of empire and glory, guttered out, not in a single dramatic fall, but in a long, slow exhaustion, a fading of wealth and unity and strength, until the mightiest civilization on earth had become, once again, a divided and diminished land, its great days behind it, drifting into the long twilight from which it would never fully emerge. The long twilight of Egypt lasted for centuries, a span of time longer than the entire history of many nations, and it is a strange and melancholy age to drift through, this slow fading of the oldest civilization on earth. Egypt did not vanish. It endured, and at times even flickered back towards something like its former dignity. But it was never again its own master for long, and each century saw it pass, one way or another, deeper into the shadow of foreign power. For a long stretch, the land remained divided and weak, ruled in pieces by rival dynasties, its unity broken, its old strength a memory. Then came a period when Egypt fell under the rule of kings descended from Libyan mercenaries and settlers. Foreigners who had come to live in Egypt over the generations, adopted its ways, and risen at last to wear its crown. They ruled as pharaohs, honored the old gods, and tried to hold the fracturing land together. But the kingdom remained troubled and divided beneath them, a patchwork of competing powers rather than the single mighty state of old. Then came one of the most remarkable reversals in all of Egyptian history. Far to the south, up the Nile in the land the Egyptians called Nubia, the land of Kush, which Egypt had once conquered and ruled and drawn its gold from in the great days of empire, a powerful kingdom had risen. And these Nubian kings, who had absorbed Egyptian culture and religion over the long centuries of Egyptian rule, now looked north at the weakness and division of Egypt and saw both an opportunity and, in their own eyes, a sacred duty. They believed themselves to be the true keepers of the ancient Egyptian ways, more faithful to the old gods and traditions than the divided, foreign-influenced north had become. And so they marched north and conquered Egypt, the once subject people becoming the masters, the children of the conquered ruling the land of their former conquerors. For a time, these Nubian pharaohs restored something genuinely fine. They reunited the land, revered the ancient gods, restored and built temples, and consciously revived the styles and traditions of Egypt's glorious past, ruling as devout and legitimate pharaohs of a reunited kingdom. It was a real, if brief, renewal, a last flowering of native-style rule presided over, in one of history's great ironies, by kings from the land Egypt had once conquered. But it could not last, because the age of the great empires had come, and against the new superpowers rising in the east, the reunited kingdom of the Nile was no match. For out of Mesopotamia had risen the most fearsome military power the world had yet seen, the Assyrians. Theirs was an empire built on war of a ruthlessness that terrified the entire ancient world, a superbly organized war machine, armed with iron weapons and expert in siege and slaughter, that had conquered nearly the whole of the Near East and boasted openly, in its inscriptions, of the terrible fates it dealt to those who resisted. And the Assyrians turned their armies toward Egypt. They came, and they were unstoppable. The Assyrian war machine smashed the armies of the Nubian pharaohs, drove them back south out of Egypt, and conquered the ancient land, even sacking and plundering the great and sacred southern capital, the holy city of the god Ammon, one of the oldest and most revered cities in Egypt, carrying off its treasures, an act of desecration that sent a shock through the whole ancient world. For the first time, one of the great Eastern war empires had conquered the Nile itself and made Egypt its subject. The oldest kingdom on earth, the land of the pyramids, had been beaten and plundered by a foreign war machine and reduced to a conquered province. When the Assyrian Empire, in its turn, weakened and fell, as all empires do, Egypt seized the moment and won back its freedom one last time, under a final native dynasty that reunited the land and presided over a modest, elegant revival. It was a wistful, backward-looking age, this last gasp of independent Egypt, in which artists deliberately imitated the masterpieces of the Old and Middle Kingdoms, gazing back across 20 centuries at the glory of their ancestors and trying to recapture it. There is something deeply moving in it, a very old civilization, sensing perhaps that its time was running out, turning to lovingly recreate its own distant youth. But the reprieve was brief, because a new and even greater power had risen in the east, the Persian Empire, the largest the world had yet seen, stretching from India to the edge of the Mediterranean. And the Persians came and conquered Egypt and folded the ancient land into their vast dominion as a single province among dozens, ruled by a Persian governor in the name of a distant great king who had never seen the Nile. The Egyptians hated Persian rule and rose against it again and again across the following centuries, winning back their independence for brief, precious spells before being crushed and reconquered each time. But the days of a truly free and native Egypt were, in the end, finished. The pharaohs of Egypt were now foreign emperors ruling from far away. The oldest kingdom on earth had become a prize, passed from one great empire to the next, and it was waiting, though it did not know it, for the young Macedonian conqueror who would take it from Persia and open its final Greek chapter. Out of the west came a young Macedonian king, leading a Greek army on the most astonishing campaign of conquest the world had ever seen. His name was Alexander, and we have followed his whole story on another night. He smashed the Persian Empire in a series of brilliant battles, and in the course of that conquest, he came to Egypt, and Egypt, groaning under the hated rule of the Persians, welcomed him not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. Alexander was crowned as pharaoh, honored as the heir to the ancient kings, and embraced by a people glad to be free of Persia. And in his brief time in Egypt, he did one thing that would outlast his entire empire. On a strip of land where the Nile's delta met the sea, he founded a new city, laid out its plan, and gave it his name, Alexandria. He then marched away east to further conquests and an early death, and never saw the city built. But Alexandria would grow, in the centuries after him, into the greatest and most brilliant city of the entire ancient world, a dazzling Greek metropolis on the Egyptian coast, home to the greatest library the ancient world ever knew, and to a towering lighthouse that was counted among the wonders of the world. We have stood beneath that lighthouse together on another night. It was Alexander's gift to Egypt, and it would become the seat of Egypt's final chapter. When Alexander died young, far away, his vast empire was torn apart by his generals, each seizing a piece. And the general who seized Egypt, a shrewd and capable man named Ptolemy, made himself its king, founding a dynasty of Greek pharaohs who would rule Egypt for the next 300 years. This was the final act. Egypt ruled not by native Egyptians, nor by Eastern conquerors, but by a line of Greek kings and queens, ruling from the glittering Greek city of Alexandria, presiding over the ancient land as foreign monarchs who mostly kept themselves apart from the Egyptian people they ruled. For 3 centuries, the Ptolemies reigned. They were, by and large, a spectacularly dysfunctional dynasty. Greeks who married their own brothers and sisters in imitation of the old pharaohs, and who murdered one another with a regularity that was shocking even by the standards of ancient royalty. Fathers killed sons, brothers killed brothers, mothers killed children, in an endless bloody scramble for the throne of the richest kingdom in the Mediterranean. And yet, under them, Alexandria blazed as the intellectual capital of the world, its library gathering the knowledge of every nation, its scholars making discoveries that would not be equaled for centuries, its lighthouse guiding ships from across the sea. Egypt in these final centuries was fabulously wealthy, culturally dazzling, and politically rotten. A magnificent, decadent, dying thing, ruled by a family of Greek killers, growing ever weaker as a new and terrible power rose in the West. Rome. Rome cast its long shadow over the last Ptolemies, who survived increasingly as clients and puppets, propped up and bullied by Roman power, their kingdom coveted for its immense wealth and its grain. It was clear to everyone that Egypt's independence was living on borrowed time, that sooner or later Rome would simply swallow the last free kingdom of the old world. And it fell to the very last of the Ptolemies, the last pharaoh Egypt would ever have, to make a final, brilliant, doomed attempt to save her kingdom from being devoured. Her name was Cleopatra. Let us linger before the end in the city that crowned Egypt's final age. For Alexandria, in the centuries of Greek rule, became something the world had never seen before and would not see again for a very long time. The greatest center of learning and splendor in the entire ancient world, a city of the mind unlike any other. The Greek kings who ruled Egypt after Alexander, the Ptolemies, poured the immense wealth of the Nile into making their capital the wonder of the age. They built it on a grand plan, with broad, straight avenues, gleaming marble buildings, palaces along the harbor, and a great causeway running out to an island in the bay. And on that island, they raised the structure that gave the city its most famous landmark and one of the wonders of the ancient world. The great lighthouse, the pharaohs, a tower of pale stone rising to an astonishing height above the harbor mouth, higher than almost anything human beings had ever built. At its summit, burned a great fire by night, and behind the fire stood a polished mirror that caught the flame and cast its light far out across the sea, guiding ships safely into the busiest harbor in the world from many miles away. We have stood beneath it together on another night and watched its keeper feed the flame. For over 1,000 years it stood and burned, a beacon visible across the water, until the slow work of earthquakes at last brought it down into the sea. It was the symbol of Alexandria, a city that was, quite literally, a light to the world. But Alexandria's true glory was not its lighthouse. It was its library, the greatest the ancient world ever knew, and one of the most important institutions in the whole history of human knowledge. The Ptolemies conceived an astonishing ambition to gather, under one roof, all the knowledge of the entire world. They sent agents across the known world to buy or copy every book they could find, in every language. They are said to have seized the scrolls carried aboard every ship that docked in the harbor, copying them and keeping the originals. They gathered the writings of the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Jews, and every other people whose learning they could obtain, until the library held a vast collection of scrolls, the accumulated wisdom, literature, science, and history of the ancient world, gathered in one place as never before or since. And around that library they built a community of scholars, drawn from across the world and supported by the wealth of Egypt to do nothing but study, think, and discover. In that extraordinary community, some of the greatest minds of antiquity did their work. It was here that a scholar calculated the size of the entire round earth with remarkable accuracy, using nothing but shadows, angles, and geometry, measuring the whole planet from a single Egyptian city. It was here that the foundations of geometry were compiled into a work that would be studied for the next 2,000 years. Here astronomers charted the heavens, geographers mapped the world, physicians advanced the study of the body, and inventors devised remarkable machines. For a few brilliant centuries, Alexandria was the intellectual capital of humankind, the place where the knowledge of the ancient world was gathered, preserved, and pushed forward. A light of learning as bright, in its way, as the great flame that burned above its harbor. And yet, for all its brilliance, the Egypt of the Ptolemies was a kingdom rotting from within. The Greek dynasty that ruled from dazzling Alexandria was one of the most murderous royal families in all of history. Greeks who had adopted the old pharaonic custom of marrying their own brothers and sisters, and who slaughtered one another for the throne with a regularity that was appalling even by the bloody standards of ancient kingship. Brothers murdered brothers, mothers murdered sons, children murdered parents, in an endless vicious scramble for the richest crown in the Mediterranean. The later Ptolemies grew weak, decadent, and increasingly dependent on the rising power of Rome, which propped them up, bullied them, and coveted their fabulous wealth and their grain. It was a magnificent, brilliant, poisoned twilight, a civilization producing the greatest learning in the world from a court dripping with murder, growing weaker with every generation, living on borrowed time in the lengthening shadow of Rome. And it would fall to the last and greatest of that dynasty, the final pharaoh Egypt would ever have, to make the last brilliant, doomed attempt to save it all, the queen whose story we have told, Cleopatra, whose death would close the 3,000-year story of the pharaohs forever. We have told Cleopatra's story in full on another night. So here, at the end of our long journey, let us simply see her for what she truly was in the great sweep of this history. The final pharaoh, the last ruler of independent Egypt, standing at the very end of a line of god-kings that stretched back 30 centuries to the first unification of the two lands. She was the most brilliant of all her dysfunctional dynasty, fiercely intelligent, learned, magnetic, the first of her Greek line even to trouble to learn the Egyptian language of the people she ruled. And she understood, with perfect clarity, the desperate position she had inherited, a fabulously rich but militarily weak kingdom, the last free land of the old world, in the shadow of an all-conquering Rome. Her whole reign was a bold, high-stakes gamble to keep Egypt free by binding herself to the most powerful men in Rome. First to Julius Caesar, and then to Mark Antony, using alliance and love and the vast wealth of Egypt to try to preserve her throne and her country's independence against the rising tide. For a time, it nearly worked, but in the end, she and Antony were defeated by Antony's cold and calculating rival, the man who would become Rome's first emperor. Their fleet was broken at a great sea battle, their cause collapsed, and Rome's legions closed in on Alexandria itself. Antony took his own life, and Cleopatra, facing capture and the final humiliation of being paraded through Rome in chains as a trophy, chose instead to die on her own terms, a queen to the last, by most accounts taking her own life by the bite of a venomous serpent, the sacred cobra of Egyptian royalty. With her death, the last pharaoh was gone, and with her, ancient Egypt itself came to an end. Rome annexed the kingdom outright, not even as an ordinary province, but as the personal possession of its emperor, its grain and its gold flowing now to feed and enrich Rome. The line of pharaohs that stretched back 3,000 years, back beyond Ramesses, beyond the boy king and the heretic, beyond Thutmose and Hatshepsut, beyond the pyramid builders, back to the very first king who joined the two lands under a single crown. That line ended forever, with the woman dead in her palace at Alexandria. There would never be another pharaoh. The oldest kingdom on earth had finally fallen and would not rise again. Think of the immensity of what had ended. Egypt had endured for 3,000 years, longer than the entire span of history from Cleopatra's death to our own day. It had risen and fallen, and risen again through age after age. The pyramid builders of the Old Kingdom, the reborn Middle Kingdom, the mighty empire of the New Kingdom, the long twilight of foreign conquest, the Greek splendor of the Ptolemies. It had outlasted droughts, collapses, invasions and heresies. It had given the world writing and monuments and gods, and an obsession with eternity that filled its deserts with tombs and treasures. And now, at last, after an almost unimaginable span of years, it was over, its independence gone, its gods soon to be forgotten, its ancient language and sacred writing destined to fall silent and be lost for millennia, until scholars in a distant future would have to painstakingly decipher the picture script all over again to hear Egypt speak. When Cleopatra died and Rome swallowed Egypt, something more than a kingdom came to an end. Over the centuries that followed, under Roman and then later rule, the ancient civilization of Egypt did not just lose its independence, it slowly lost its very self. The old religion, with its ancient gods, gradually faded and was forgotten as new faiths spread across the land. The old ways of life dissolved, and most poignantly of all, the ancient knowledge itself fell silent. The beautiful picture writing of the hieroglyphs, the sacred script that had recorded 3 millennia of Egyptian life, that covered every temple wall and tomb and monument, stopped being written, and then stopped being read, until at last there was no one left alive anywhere in the world who could understand a single sign of it. Think of what that means. For thousands of years, Egypt had written its story across its monuments in gorgeous, intricate detail. The names of its kings, the deeds of its gods, the prayers of its dead. And then, for the better part of 2 millennia, all of it fell silent. The temples still stood. The tombs still held their treasures. The hieroglyphs still covered every wall. But no one could read them. Egypt's own voice had been lost. Travelers and conquerors wandered among the vast ruins, awed by their scale and mystery, and could not understand a word of the writing that blanketed them. The oldest and greatest civilization of the ancient world had become a land of silent, incomprehensible wonders, its meaning locked away, its story unreadable, gathering sand. And then, at the very end of the 18th century, more than 1700 years after Cleopatra, the silence began, at last, to break. A French army under a famous general invaded Egypt, and with the soldiers came scholars, scientists and artists sent to study and record the wonders of the ancient land. And among the things they found, half buried near a town in the delta, was a single broken slab of dark stone that would prove to be one of the most important objects ever discovered, the Rosetta Stone. What made it priceless was simple. The same message had been carved upon it 3 times, in 3 different scripts, once in the ancient hieroglyphs, once in a later Egyptian script, and once in Greek. And Greek could still be read. Here at last was a key, the same text, in the lost language and in a known one, side by side. Scholars realized at once that if they could match the readable Greek to the unreadable hieroglyphs, they might finally crack the code that had defeated the world for nearly 20 centuries and make ancient Egypt speak again. It took years of brilliant, painstaking work by scholars in several countries, but at last a young French genius, gifted in languages and obsessed with Egypt since childhood, broke through. Studying the stone and other inscriptions, he cracked the system of the hieroglyphs, proving that the signs were not simply pictures or magic symbols, as people had long assumed, but a real writing system that recorded the sounds and words of a real language. It is said that when the solution finally came clear to him, when he suddenly understood how the whole system worked, he ran to his brother's office, cried out that he had it, and collapsed in a faint from the shock of it. He had done the impossible. He had given Egypt back its voice. And with that breakthrough, the whole silent, buried, forgotten world of ancient Egypt came flooding back to life. Suddenly, the writing on every temple wall and tomb and monument could be read again. The names of the long-forgotten kings could be spoken. The prayers, the records, the stories, the boasts, the everyday accounts, 3,000 years of a civilization's own words, silent for 2 millennia, could once more be understood. A whole new science was born, dedicated to recovering and studying the ancient land, and scholars poured into Egypt to read its walls and dig into its sands. And what they found, over the generations that followed, astonished the world again and again. The temples deciphered, the tombs opened, the mummies of the great pharaohs recovered, and most famously of all, the untouched tomb of a forgotten boy king brought back into the light with all its golden treasure, on a night we have already shared. So Egypt did not truly die. It fell, and it fell silent, and for a long age it lay buried and unread beneath the sand. But it was too great to be lost forever. Its monuments were too vast, its writing too enduring, its hold on the human imagination too strong. And so it was found again, and read again, and given its voice again, and it speaks to us now across the immense gulf of time. Its kings and gods and ordinary people reaching out of the deep past to be known once more. Every time we gaze at the pyramids, or read the name of a pharaoh, or fall asleep to the story of that ancient world, we are part of Egypt's strange and wonderful afterlife. The eternity it always longed for, achieved at last, not in the way its people imagined, but achieved all the same. They wanted, above all things, to be remembered forever. And here we are, thousands of years later, in the dark, remembering. And yet nothing so great ever truly vanishes. Egypt fell, but it did not disappear. It left behind the pyramids, still standing on their plateau after 4.5 millennia, the oldest wonder of the world and the only one still with us. It left the Sphinx, still gazing east at the dawn. It left the vast temples along the river, the painted tombs, the golden treasures, the colossal statues of its god-kings half buried in the sand. It left the mummies of its pharaohs, and the name of a boy king who would become the most famous of them all. It left a civilization so deep and so enduring that we are still, thousands of years later, digging up its wonders and marveling at them, still telling its stories in the darkness, still falling asleep to the memory of it, as you are beginning to now. 3,000 years of pharaohs, risen and fallen, all of it flowing past us tonight like the great river that made it, and coming at last, like the river, to the sea. So let it all grow quiet now, and settle, and drift away into the dark. The green ribbon in the desert, and the yearly flood, the first crown that joined the two lands, the mountains of stone rising at Giza, and the golden empire of the conquering kings, and the heretic in his desert city, and the boy in his hidden tomb, and the great Ramesses covering the land with his name, the long twilight, and the conquerors from the east, and the young Macedonian who founded a city he never saw, and the last brilliant queen dying in her palace by the sea. 3,000 years of it, rising and falling like the river, all of it flowing past and gone. You don't have to hold any of it. It has all already happened, long ago. The story is complete. The river has reached the sea. There is nothing left in all those vanished ages that needs anything of you now. Only the quiet, and the dark, and the deep rest at the end of the long journey. So let the pharaohs and their pyramids and their river blur and fade, and let yourself sink down out of the whole long stream of it into the still, deep dark beneath, where there are no kingdoms to rise or fall, and no ages to turn, and nothing at all that needs you tonight. Rest now. The oldest kingdom in the world has come to the end of its long day, and so have you. Let it go and sleep. And when the dark comes down again, I'll be here to carry you off to another time long ago, while the wonder of it still stands. Sleep well.